Hello, my name's Bethany. I'm editor of Quilt Now magazine, and today we're back in the studio with Sarah Payne.
Hello.
Hello. Sarah's here to answer some of your questions. So now in our second video, Sarah's going to be giving you some tips and advice and demonstrating a few techniques for us.
Exactly.
So our first question comes from Susan, and she says, I'm really finding freehand embroidery difficult. Do you have any hints? I can't seem to get a rhythm. And Hayley also says, me too. I'm really struggling to relax and get a smooth pattern.
Yes, now that's a common thing that we hear with free motion quilting, and there's a number of things that you can do with that. First of all, ensure that you've got a nice flat work surface, you know, something with a decent bit of space, so that you can get your work nice and smooth. Also, if you can, make sure your bottom mat or your table in this case is quite clear. So if it gets mucky, bit of polish, it helps things move nice and smoothly. The second thing you need to do is relax, and that can be really tricky. And myself, even though I do free motion a lot, I always do about 20 minutes before I work on my project, just so that I can relax my shoulders, I can get in a comfortable position, and I can get smooth movement. Because if you're tense in any way at all, you won't get a nice smooth corner.
It's hard because you are concentrating as
you are concentrating, and I find I make my concentrating face, which is a bit like that, when I'm concentrating too hard, and that kind of doesn't help too. Also try and keep your elbows away, all right, because what people tend to do is they'll rest their elbows on their extension table like this, and that again impedes free movement. So what we want to do is, first of all, we're going to drop the needle, okay, into our project. So I've got a bit of what we call a quilt sandwich here. Drop the needle, she says, and pull the bottom thread up, there we go, and pull the bottom thread up onto the top. Now I've got a white thread on the bottom and I've got a black thread on the top, just so that you can see them. And we want to tuck them out of the way. So relax and practice. Now I'm doing this standing up. I don't normally quilt standing up at home, but you can sometimes find that it frees up your shoulders and it gives you a nice posture. So think about your posture. But first of all, we're going to do a few stitches, and then once you've got your feed dogs down, you should be able to start moving in a nice smooth movement. Now I'm just going to stop here and pull my thread out of the way, and then what you've got to concentrate on is trying to get an even movement between the speed of your stitches and the speed that you move it with. If you stitch too slowly and move your hands too fast, you end up with very jagged, and you can hear it, even and jagged stitches. If you conversely move very slowly but move your foot very fast, as in your presser foot underneath, you end up with something very small and tight. So what you're trying to do is get something in between. Now it's very useful as well, if I just move to another position, when you're learning, start off with a drawn line or an area like this. I'm just going to do a quick square, and it doesn't matter if this isn't completely accurate as a square, we're just using it as a basis, and then try and move from one side to the other in smooth movements, curving at the bottom and then just almost making sausage shapes. Keep the machine moving and keep it nice and smooth. Okay, again, you'll find that if you move your hands too quickly, you lose control a little bit like that. So also you can have a play with designs like little flowers. And this is a great way of just practicing with your machine, getting some curves, getting that speed right, and just practicing. So you can see, again, we don't have to be hugely accurate at this point. It's about trying to get smoothness, and that will also come from muscle memory, from practice. So the big tips with something like this is actually practice, relax, and just have some fun. Don't really obsess. If you find, for example, when I'm doing feathers, my feathers up one side, beautiful, not so much coming down the other side. So what I do is I quilt up that way, then I come down to the bottom, and then I quilt up the other side. Go with what you're happy with. If you find that a lot of your curves come out pointy, do pointy curves. No one's going to know.
Exactly. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Steph also asks, do you have any advice on quilting on a home machine?
Yes, actually, now that's a really big question that I get asked a lot, because this is the machine that I use a lot at home. In fact, I do 99% of my projects on this machine, and you'll notice it's not a massive throat on this, and I do double bed quilts. Now, what you want to do with a large project is just make sure that this particular area here is smooth. Yeah. That means pushing all of your quilt through onto the back of your table, then just do it. Make sure you've got a lot of space, because when you've got quilts hanging off at the front or the back, it actually pulls your work to one side and can distort your quilting. But concentrate on getting this area smooth. I don't roll my quilts because I find that makes them too stiff and too rigid. I basically get hold of a big lump of quilt, stuff it through there, and I've got another bit over my shoulder and a bit more piled up at the side. But all I need is this area here right in front of me, probably about a hand span like that, to be smooth. Everything else can be all mixed up and sort of piled everywhere. Just make sure you don't knock your cup of tea onto the floor while you're doing it. Smooth that bit out. When you've quilted that area, move on to the next, and then keep squishing it through. I like to call it the squish technique. Squish it through, and that'll help you work with a smaller machine.
Thanks very much. Barbara has asked, I would love to know how to join the blocks when doing quilt as you go.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put a different foot and raise the feet dogs on my machine, and then we can come back and show you that. Basically, there are a number of different ways of doing it. One I'm going to show you is a very quick sashed method, because I like sashing on a quilt as you go block, because it makes a big deal of the individual blocks. So to do that, I've got 2 blocks here. It also means that I just have to trim everything to size. I don't have to have my wadding as a different size to the rest of it. So I've quilted my 2 blocks, and what I've got is I've got 2 pieces of sashing. The front piece of sashing in this case is cut to 1 inch, and my back piece of sashing, which I've chosen to match my backing, is 1 3/4 inches wide, folded in half. Okay, so what I'm going to do is the front piece of sashing goes right sides together with the front block, and I always cut these slightly larger, ready for movement, because when you're sewing, things can move, and it's really annoying if you can trim stuff off. It's very hard to add it on. So on the back of that, I am going to put the back piece, which is folded over, and the raw edges match up with the raw edges of the quilt. So the folded edge is here, and I'm just going to use my clips to hold these in place, because I've got a number of pieces now, and it's just easier to keep it under control. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Now I've got black thread on here so you can see what I'm doing. I've also used my walking foot on this, because the walking foot will keep control of all these layers, including the wadding. So the black thread will show you what I'm actually doing. So we start at the very end, and I've moved my needle seam at a 1/4 inch, and then we're going to stitch with all of these layers, and then trim off the thread at the end. Okay, I would normally press this at this point as well. So what we do now is we take the next block, and we are going to put that right sides together. I want to make sure that my block edge lines up, but we're only stitching with that front piece of sashing this time. Okay, the back piece is tucked out of the way. And actually, when I made my first quilt, I made a sampler quilt, and it was a double bed quilt, and we didn't use this technique. And I really wished we had, because I would have enjoyed it a lot more. So
is this how you always join the blocks in Quilt as you go?
It is Quilt as you go if I'm using sashing.
Right.
Okay, you can use the same technique with wider sashing, but you have to add a piece of wadding in between. So again, I'm going to stitch, so I'm stitching my second block to the first, but through that piece of front sashing. And obviously you wouldn't use black thread, you would use a cream thread. It just doesn't show up very well on camera. So just come to the end. Quilt as you go is also a fantastic technique if you want to practice your free motion quilting and you're a little nervous of doing it on a big project.
Or so you want to try different quilting on different blocks.
Exactly, exactly. Or you've got a very small machine. So when we hold this onto the front now, you'll see that we have our front sashing, and it's lying nice and flat. And then on the back, we have these two pieces that lie flat. Because we've used a 1/4 inch seam allowance and our front piece of sashing is 1 inch, it means that they will lie flat like this. This extra long piece we fold over the top here, and you can either slip stitch down like this, or if I'm in a real hurry, what I do is I use my trusty glue pen. I glue that in place, and then I'll actually stitch in the ditch from the front. And because it's glued in place, I'll know that I'll catch all of that. But basically that's it. So what you end up with on the back is a little bit of sashing on the back, and then on the front, we've got that sashing, and that strip is now ready to go. So we will continue doing that on all the blocks in a row, and then we put the whole row together like that. And that's how you do quilt as you go.
Yeah, well, that was really nice to see. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. I've got a question again from a different Barbara. It says, I'm working on a pattern called Starlight, which requires triangles to be sewn together.
Yeah.
Says, I'm following the appropriate cutting measurements, but I'm finding the bottom curves at the end, so it's not allowing the seams to align.
Okay, now that's a common problem again. When you're working with a block, as you come to the edge of the block, there's less for you to hold on to, and you'll find that your block will curve. What I do is I use a stitch ripper or a stiletto just to hold on to the very edge of the block as it comes right up into the machine. Otherwise, it just does naturally twist off. And then what you end up with is a beautiful 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around until it squiffs off at the bottom. And the bit at the bottom is the bit that you really need to be accurate so that your points match up. So just feed it in carefully with a stiletto right at the end. I also find that if I'm doing half square triangles like that, doing the chain piecing method, which means you put the next one straight through, gives you something to hold on to. So you're actually stitching from one block straight onto the next, and you're less likely to get that little kink off at the bottom.
Lots of little ends, you're not having that. Yeah, very good, thank you. Emma has asked, so away from the machine now, she said, do you think it's easier to use glue pens or to baste your English paper piecing shapes? I know your answer to this.
I glue based. I do. I absolutely love my my Stix 2 fabric glue pen. I actually worked with Stix 2 to develop this glue pen because I couldn't get hold of one that I really liked. It's a temporary glue. You don't use very much of it because it's got a texture like lipstick rather than Pritt stick. So you just use a little line of it, but it dries clear very quickly and it's completely removable. And it means that I can do sort of 100 hexagons in an episode of Morse. So it takes a lot to stitch based. I'm a lot slower than that. So, you know, I can do 3 a minute when I glue based, which for me, I want to get onto the fun bit. I want to get onto the sewing, and it also saves your fingers because you don't have to stitch through your cards.
And saves your thread as well.
It saves your thread too.
So it's kind of the difference between having a pile of hexes that's this big or maybe a pile that's this big.
Exactly. And when you're working with curves as well, so if you're working with apple core or clamshells, I wouldn't do it without glue because actually folding those edges over your curves is a real nightmare if you're not using the glue. So personally, you know, I like all the modern things that make my life easier. So, but there are people out there who swear by the stitch basting. If that's your bag, then by all means do it. I'm not the quilt police.
Yeah, totally personal preference.
Exactly, yeah.
Jackie has asked, she says, I still find it difficult to cut straight. How do you start it off?
Okay, now again, I used to do a workshop called Cutting, because it's amazing how many people struggle to cut. And one of the main things that people do when they start is that they don't start cutting before the fabric. Because your rotary cutter is actually a curve, if you think about it, what people do is this is the edge of their fabric. They would put their rotary cutter on here and they're missing the first couple of stitches on the fabric, or the first couple of threads. So start cutting 1/4 inch before the edge of your fabric. So have the ruler coming right in front of it like this. Start with your rotary cutter here and then move it. Also try, if you can, to use your fingers to spread the load on the ruler when you're pressing down. So press in a down position rather than a slidey one.
Especially if it's quite a long cut.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also with a long ruler like that, stop halfway through, reposition your hands. But when I'm working on TV, we're always cutting in a standing up position, and the tables can be quite high, which I can find a bit tricky. But at home, my table's sort of this height, and that is a much better position for me because the pressure is a downward pressure onto the ruler. It is less likely to slip. If you've got a forward pressure like that, it's easy to make your ruler slip. And you obviously, with rulers and those blades, you've got to be really careful. Yeah. But to start it, start just before your fabric.
Yeah, that's a really good tip, because especially you want those corners to match. You want
those
points to match. And if you've started it off on a curve, then you've got no chance.
And quite often what people will do is they won't have an even pressure. So when they take the ruler away, they've actually missed a bit here and a bit here. That might be because you've got a nick out of your blade. If they're at regular points, it means you've got a little blunt patch on your blade and you need to replace your blade. Or it might be that you've not got an even pressure. Or it might be you've got something under your mat which stops it, because you need the mat to be flat. And if there's a divot in your table or a place where two tables match, you don't get that pressure and it won't cut over that. So a smooth work surface as well is really important.
And with rotary cutters, how often do you change the blade in your rotary cutter?
When they don't cut anymore.
Fair enough, yeah. Depends how much cutting you've been doing.
Yes, and try and avoid cutting over pins, because that will kill a brand new blade in 10 seconds flat. I've done that too.
And finally, so Wendy has asked, she says, I've never understood this whole iron to the dark side on blocks. Which way do you iron if there is no dark side?
Now that's also a very interesting question, because we do say press to the dark side, and that is because if you're using a light and a dark and you press the dark under the light, you can often see it. If there is no dark side, I look to see which is the most patterned. So I will press it underneath the pattern side. But also it's about pressing your blocks in opposite directions, because if you've got a row of blocks this way and you can press all of those seams that way and all of those seams that way, then it makes matching up those seams much easier, because you can lock them together with your fingers. But if you've got a light and a dark, then you may end up alternating them. So it's not a hard and fast rule. It is, if you can, press to the dark side. But if there isn't a dark side and you've got a plain and a pattern, press under the pattern, or you may just have to throw that rule out of the room completely and press according to the design. Sometimes I press flat, but that will be because of the particular design. If I'm quilting in the ditch as well, pressing to one side gives me a nice ridge to quilt up against. So when you stitch in the ditch, that's the area between your two blocks. And when you've pressed it to one side, it means you end up with a nice sort of line or a nice valley to quilt into. So it's not always press to the dark side, just if you can.
Thank you very much. And that's the end of our questions. So thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to find out any more about Sarah Payne, please head online to www.sarahpayne.co.uk or visit the Quilt Now website, which is www.quiltnow.co.uk. Thanks for watching.